My name is Gordon Scroggy Wiley. I'm a retired naval officer, a rank of captain. My father was in the United States Navy. He went to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1915, became a naval airship lighter-than-air person in 1923, and served on the USS Shenandoah, USS Los Angeles, USS Akron, and USS Macon, the model of which you see here. My father was the executive officer of the USS Akron, which crashed off of 1933 February off of New Jersey coast. The crew of the Akron was 74. There were 3 survivors and 71 killed, including Admiral Moffett, for which Moffett Field is named. All the crew died except for 3, one of which was my father, in the ocean. In February in the Atlantic Ocean, you can imagine how cold it was.
The Navy dirigible Akron is gone. 73 homes are desolate, in mourning for men who will not return. Many of the officers who originally manned the $6 million dirigible when she was commissioned in August 1931 were on duty when the storm struck at midnight. Commander Frank C. McCord, 43-year-old commanding officer of the Akron, who died when his ship collapsed and sank. And the Akron's first crew, many of whom faced death with him unflinchingly. Lieutenant Commander Wiley, the only surviving officer, paid tribute to them when he reported, "Discipline perfect." The 3 lone survivors of the air disaster leave the Coast Guard destroyer Tucker at Brooklyn Navy Yard. Richard E. Deal, exhausted but not seriously hurt, is carried off. Wrapped in a blanket, Moody E. Irwin comes off the boat, followed by Lieutenant Commander Herbert V. Wiley, second in command of the Akron.
Commander Wiley, can you tell us a little something about how the thing happened?
The Akron's maximum speed of 84 land miles an hour availed nothing against the might of the storm. The highest-ranking officer aboard the stricken vessel, Admiral William A. Moffett, here on the right, had crowned a notable career by his service as Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Inside the stricken aircraft, the men had little chance, according to experts. Most of them were drowned as the dirigible sank into the sea. Many of the country's largest cities knew the Akron, the world's largest airship, 785 feet long, kept aloft by 6,500,000 cubic feet of helium.
After he survived the crash of the Akron, and by the way, he previously had been commanding officer of the Los Angeles, and he was operations officer of the USS Shenandoah, which crashed in Ohio, 1926. He went to sea, and he was on the USS Cincinnati, and then he got orders to report for commanding officer of the Macon.
Attention! Navy Department, Bureau of Navigation, Washington, D.C.
Reported in 1934, about 18 months after the crash of the Akron. These orders were specific that he should fly it and prove to the Navy that they were worthwhile. The first thing he had been in command for approximately 2 months when he conceived the idea of a demonstration that would catch everybody's attention. He had heard that President Roosevelt on the USS Houston was going to the Pacific, to Honolulu, and the president liked to fish, and it was his Navy, so all my father knew was at the time it would transit the Panama Canal. So he did a dead reckoning of where the ship should be, and they flew four little of their aircraft, the little Sparrowhawks, and they made an intercept. The intercept was about 1,100 miles from shore. The captain of the ship was certainly mad because here came four little airplanes 1,100 miles out to sea with no wheels. And in those days they carried a belly tank which looked like a bomb. And here they started dropping things on his ship. As a result, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific recommended my father for court-martial for what he did. President Roosevelt intervened and said it was one of the best exercises he'd ever seen, and told the Navy, forget about it. So he was promoted right after that. The Macon flew about 3 to 4 times per month in various types of exercises. Many of the exercises were designed to train the aircraft, the scouting aircraft, in various attack techniques, scouting techniques, and lots of practice landing on the trapeze. The aircraft, if you look at this model here in the Sparrowhawk, you will see on top a structure with a hook on it. This trapeze hung down below the airship. The airship went at its maximum speed of about 75 knots, about 80 miles an hour. And the aircraft approached just above their stalling speed. The pilot then maneuvered his aircraft to place the hook on the trapeze. They were then hauled up into the aircraft, into the hangar, taken off the trapeze, and the trapeze was put down for the next one to come aboard. The men in the flying trapeze were a group of hot pilots, about, as I remember, 7 of them. They flew the 5 aircraft, had a very famous patch that my father designed. It showed him, it was called the Man on the Flying Trapeze, and you have a picture here in which the large man on the trapeze is the dirigible, the airship, and the small skinny guy is the Sparrowhawk. In naval aviation, in carrier aviation, we use the term trapped. A plane comes in, catches a wire, and he says, I trapped. Guess where that term came from? Came from the trapeze on the airships. And when the guy hooked on, he was trapped. The Sparrowhawk was only 28 feet long and 1,800 pounds, had a 435 horsepower engine. Its maximum speed was about 185 miles an hour with wheels off, about 160 with the wheels on. It had a range of about 300 miles with the belly tank. There were never any accidents, but however, there were a couple of problems. And one time, the problem was that the hook stuck on the trapeze, and a officer by the name of Lieutenant Mayer climbed down that trapeze in the open, no parachute, with a monkey wrench in his hand, and pounded on the hook until it released. And the airplane then released and dove away. The outside of that, essentially no accidents, no problems. The Sparrowhawk pilots became quite proficient. When they first began, they would frequently miss the trapeze and the hook and have to go around. But however, as they became more proficient, It would take, they could take aboard an aircraft about every 4 minutes. The Sparrowhawks were lowered out of the hangar on the trapeze, one at a time. The pilot revved up the engine. Once he was given the signal by the airship that all things were ready, he had a cable with a little handle on it in his cockpit. That cable ran up to the hook, and he would give it a jerk, and the airplane would go vroom, right back up. So that was the way they launched. The way they made a landing on the trapeze, they came in, flew under the airship, tried to match the speed, and the structure on top of the wing where the hook was high enough so it was above the propeller. And so he would try to push that hook, which had about a 2.5-inch gap in it, onto the trapeze. On February 12th, 1935, the Macon, having participated for about a week with the United States Pacific Fleet maneuvers off of Southern California, they were passing Point Sur when she had a structural failure in which a wind shear ripped the upper fin, which you can see on this model is very large compared to the rest of this airship, off. The structural failure caused lots of pieces of metal and things to puncture the after 3 gas cells. My father, because of his experience in airships, immediately recognized he had a problem. He ordered ballast and fuel to be dropped, which was observed by the lighthouse keepers. The ship immediately put on full power to keep flying and not dropping into the water. She went up into the clouds, which were about 300 feet above where the casualty happened. The airship flew for about 25 minutes as my father decided what to do. He thought at first they could save the ship. He began to realize that he could not after the casualty because of her nose up and full power, or what's called pressure altitude, which is where the automatic valves release helium, and that she now had a sinking situation, and he had to decide whether to try to land in the mountains, which were about 4 miles away, or land in the water. He decided, because of the experience, that a water landing would be much less hazardous to crew, and so he ordered the ship put down in a controlled crash in the ocean, having sent out an SOS to the fleet. The fleet was responding and proceeding to where the crash scene was as fast as they could. They landed in the water tail first. Her nose was about 180 feet out of the water when the tail was in the water. The first casualty was the radioman who wore glasses. He lost his glasses. He jumped and he was lost. The other casualty of the total crew was the Filipino mess steward, who for some reason or other ran aft where the ship was in the water. They waited until they could get, the nose got down far enough that they could safely get into their life rafts, and they boarded their life rafts, waited for the naval vessels to come, which was by this time in the dark. But there was some gasoline that had been dropped that was on fire and made a very eerie scene, and with all of also the searchlights from the naval vessels. 81 survivors was boarded and taken to San Francisco. The situation was one of control all the time. There had been a lot of criticism of dropping that ballast and things like that, but I think my father was the most experienced airship man in the country, and I think he knew what he was doing. It's interesting to note that the crash of the Macon, which was ended all plans. There were plans, there were drawings, they were getting ready to build another one. But that ended the airship era for naval aviation. Well, riding on the airship was a very smooth and quiet experience. It was so quiet, for instance, when my father flew over our house when we were stationed at Lakehurst, he would drop his hat out of the control cabin and shout down to my mother to bring the car. He was going to be landing in about a half hour. The Macon lies at 1,500 feet inside the 3-mile limit. The parts of the ship are scattered in 3 large debris fields. It's almost hard to describe it. Here was something that your father had been on 50 years before, luckily had survived. It was a feeling of, here was the end of naval aviation involvement in dirigibles. It was a feeling of, gosh, what a mess. Just small pieces scattered all over. Although we identified engines, propellers, the 4 aircraft are still sitting as they were in the hangar when she went down. My sister was in Moss Landing. She'd been birding in Elkhorn Slough, and there's a restaurant there. It's not there anymore. And on the wall was a piece of girder, which she immediately recognized as airship construction. And there was also, in that girder mounting, was a newspaper article with a picture of my father, and she went to the man who owned the restaurant and asked, you know, where he'd gotten it, and he said he'd gotten it from a friend, but who was the friend he would not tell because he was sworn to secrecy. Chris Gresh later was able to talk him into telling us where that had come from. It was a fisherman. He was retired. He fished off the coast here. He moved to Richmond, whereas Chris and Dick Sands went up and interviewed him about would he tell us where he found it. Turned out that in fishing he had snagged it in his net, and they asked him where. Could he give them any hint as to where, and he said, yeah, he would tell them. The previous restaurant owner, the reason he didn't want to tell was because the fishing ground was so good that he didn't want anybody else to know where it was.
It's up ship for Navy Day at Sunnyvale, California, as the giant dirigible Macon goes aloft on a demonstration flight to show you how our only air warship operates. We are going through the chart room to the control car from which the ship is steered. And here is the catwalk, extending the whole length of the airship. The cloud car, a one-man observation car, is lowered away. This enables the huge airship to float above the clouds, hidden from the ground, while the lone observer below the clouds reports by telephone. The dirigible's planes can be launched and picked up in midair. Floating majestically in the sky, the Macon is a sight thrilling to every American, an impressive symbol of our Navy's air power.